Stand by, we'll roll call in a moment. Good morning and welcome to the September 10th special City Council meeting. I'll call us to order and recognize that we're having today's meeting on Treaty 6 territory, the traditional territory of the Cree, the Dene, the Nakota Sioux, the Saulteaux, and the Blackfoot peoples, as well as one of the great homelands of the Métis Nation. And I will roll call to establish attendance. I'm pleased to be able to tell you I tested negative, so glad to be able to run this last meeting from this seat rather than from the home office. So feeling much better too. So thanks for your well wishes, folks. Councillor Banga, are you there?
Good morning, sir.
Morning. Councillor Cartmill.
Good morning.
Morning. Councillor Caterina.
Good morning.
Morning. Councillor Zadig.
Good morning.
Morning. Councillor Essinger.
Good morning.
Morning. Councillor Hamilton.
Good morning.
Morning. Councillor Henderson. Oh, not so much. Councillor Knack.
Good morning.
Morning. Councillor McKean.
Present.
Live and on deck. Councillor Nickel.
Good morning.
Morning. Councillor Paquette.
Good morning.
Morning. And Councillor Walters advised me he'll be joining us here in person very shortly, so he's on his way. Okay, that's plenty to get started. I need a motion to adopt the agenda, which just has the one item of 4.1.
I'm happy
Councillor
to
Essinger?
move the September 10th, 2021 special city council meeting agenda with the addition of 4.1.
Thank you. Seconder?
Second.
Thank you, Councillor Banga. Please vote.
I'm a yes.
Yes.
We have all the votes, Mr. Chair.
Display the vote, please. That's carried unanimously. Protocol items. Don't think we have any this morning. Selection of items for debate. I mean, we're just here for 4.1, so I'll select that. We have no requests to speak or time specifics, no bylaws to deal with. Mr. Corbould, thank you for turning this around quickly since Wednesday, actually. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mayor and Councillors. Joining me this morning are the members of the Executive Leadership Team, as always, Nicole Pari and Nancy Jacobson from the COVID-19 Recovery Advisory Task Team. We do not have an AHS representative with us this morning. Today I want to quickly cover the current city bylaw requiring temporary face coverings and the new Alberta Public Health Order on the same topic. And I'd like to propose some principles of how we align the two and recommend 3 bylaw amendments. Administration began implementation of the temporary face covering bylaw effective Friday, September 3rd. The bylaw requires a mask or temporary face covering in indoor public places and public vehicles. It grants exemptions to the requirements in the 7 situations which are outlined on the screen and were approved last week by Council as part of that bylaw. Effective Saturday, September 4th, the Government of Alberta required masks in all indoor places, both those which are publicly accessible and those for employees only. It also applies in commercial vehicles and health facilities. There are exceptions to the public health order. Many of the exceptions are similar to the cities. For example, children under 2, people with disabilities, people who are eating or drinking while seated, and people who are doing physical activities. There are also 2 notable differences: performance activities and worship services. More about that in a moment. Generally, I'm highlighting that masking requirements of the new provincial health order and Edmonton's bylaw are slightly different from one another. We have heard from Edmontonians that this is confusing, and so today we are bringing some options forward for your consideration. We have identified some principles to be used as you consider this. First, we think it's important to define terms in the same way, and so we propose to adjust some definitions. Who is exempt, for example, to align with the provincial definition. This approach recognizes the role of provincial government in health policy leadership, but more importantly, it also recognizes the confusion that Edmontonians are having over some of the different terms. Second, we do think it's important to recognize provincial authority to set public health orders. Where the province has required that masks be worn, we do not propose they be removed. In other words, Edmonton's requirements would be in addition to any provincial rules. Third, to ensure reasonable and practical approaches, we believe that requirements need to be sensible, clear, and easy to understand. And fourth, to recognize that in light of the high rates of community transmission which triggered our bylaw, the city may choose to go further than the provincial order and introduce requirements which make sense in our community. And to be clear, council certainly has the authority to impose local restrictions even if the province has not. With those principles in mind, the following are our recommendations. The city bylaw applies in areas that are accessible to the public. This includes theaters, playhouses, and bars, which are publicly accessible, and the bylaw technically requires that everyone in these areas are masked. The provincial order contains an exemption for performance activities such as in theater, where actors cannot remain distant from one another. The province has allowed actors and musical performers to remove their masks while on stage, and the city has not. This was a challenge for local arts, theater, musical, and entertainment community. Instead, we propose to allow performers to be exempt from the mask requirement when they are physically distanced from their audience, even if they are not necessarily distanced from each other. Similarly, rules in karaoke venues would require singers to be masked when they are in the audience or waiting their turn. They would not need to be masked while performing, but they do need to be physically distanced from their audience or behind some sort of a barrier. People who are dancing as a social activity are not performing, so they will still need to wear masks when together on the dance floor. We think this approach strikes the right balance between ensuring the vitality of the arts sector and protecting public safety. In short, audiences must be masked. Performers do not need to be masked, but they do need to be 6 feet away from their audience or behind a barrier. The provincial order also contains a broad exemption for worship services at a place of worship. In those situations, our bylaws require that masks be worn indoors. We are proposing a balanced restriction. We propose that only those that are directly participating in or leading a religious service would be exempt from the mask bylaw, provided they are separated or barriered from those attending the ceremony. For example, the wedding party at a wedding service would not need to be masked if they are 6 feet away from their families, and everyone else watching that service would need to be masked. If those participating in the service wish to remain masked, of course, they are free to do so. Given our local transmission rates and the number of people who might be attending any religious service, I believe that requiring attendees at religious services to wear a mask is a reasonable approach. I would also highlight that we have not received any formal requests from the faith community for an exemption for the whole crowd. We have had a couple of minor informal discussions about essentially the exemption we are proposing, which is that those at the center of the ceremony be exempt. The next amendment is to allow me to respond to changing exceptional circumstances as the city manager. To be clear, this would be a temporary and narrow window. Under the principles for exemption, I can not consider an exemption which would undo any provincial requirement to wear a mask. Essentially, if the CMOH, Chief Medical Health Authority, says you have to wear a mask, I am not about to change that. Nor would I grant an exemption to any individual person who objects to the convenience or to the inconvenience. So we won't be issuing individual people exemptions. I think it's responsible for administration to respond quickly should circumstances change. An example relates to concerns we have heard from event organizers who are requiring proof of vaccination or recent test results to enter events and believe that masking requirements are unnecessary barrier. If the province should choose to introduce a vaccine passport, we may wish to consider exemption in some of those situations, but we would wait and see what the details are. This arrangement simply provides the opportunity to make adjustments without the need to recall council. I appreciate that this is not our standard approach to making bylaws, but these are not standard times. And I appreciate the trust it would signify, in administration. And with that, I'd be happy to take your questions.
Thank you. Can't see the speakers list. Councillor Essinger?
Thank you, and thank you very much for this recommendation. I think it's a very balanced approach. I guess one of the things, I was contacted by some faith organizations, and they weren't objecting to it, but they were worried about just understanding it. So how would you propose to communicate this out? Because I think a lot of them were just looking for clarity more than anything.
Yeah, thanks, Councillor. We'll communicate as we always do to the broader public, but we would be happy to have a discussion with the faith organizations, and I'm sure I can ask our Padre, John Dowds, to have a discussion and hold just a clarifying conversation. We could do that as early as this afternoon or Monday, so that they were clear.
Yeah, because I think from the conversations I've had, they want to comply. They just weren't sure how it all worked together. So I think that communication will strengthen their ability to tell the folks, why there's wearing masks and why performers perhaps are not. So thank you very much. I really appreciate this. And I think it's a great way forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Essinger. Councillor McKean?
Yeah, Mr. Corbold, I also really appreciate this. We are getting, I think, as you know, a number of inquiries from the live music industry locally. So will we be able to say that you don't need plexiglass if the stage is separated by X amount of space? Like, have we come up with that sort of number?
Yes, 6 feet.
Okay,
6
great.
feet minimum,
Yeah,
and a very hard minimum, or some sort of physical barrier.
yeah. And, but if you're dancing with a mask.
You are indeed, because you're not performing, and it's a health risk for all those people to be on the dance floor, and you can't have physical distancing, and you would have to wear a mask.
Yeah.
Or,
And
or
how,
choose not to dance if you
Yeah.
feel that is too awkward for you.
and just one more question, because I suspect we're still going to get queries coming in. Are we going to put an FAQ up or something, or get that out through the BIAs, or even directly to the venues if we know they've had questions in the past?
Yeah, we will indeed communicate with all of them, and to be honest, some of these recommendations are as a result of discussions with BIAs and the folks who are dealing directly with some of the performing arts. So we've had more consultation than we could before, the original bylaw came into effect last week, and that's been helpful towards putting these recommendations together.
Well, this is, as the mayor said, this really quick turnaround. I appreciate it. Mr. Mayor, I'd be happy to put first reading on the floor right now.
Sure, that's in order. We can keep asking questions, but if you want the first reading of that.
Second.
Seconded by Councillor Essinger. Okay, so first reading's on the floor. Thank you, Councillor McKean. Councillor Banga?
Thank you. Again, my sincere thanks to administration for coming up with this, exceptional kind of middle of the road approach. And I think most of the Edmontonians will be happy with that. But anyway, I have some clarifying questions. My first one is verified health condition. So who has to be authorizing that?
Sorry, I'm not sure I understood the question, Councillor. Authorize what?
If verified health condition, if underlying health condition, is it the doctor, any doctor, or is it, I don't know, who would be able to authorize those?
Yeah, that is clear in the bylaw, so I'll just ask Ms. Jacobson to confirm very specifically.
Thanks, Mr. Corbold. Councillor Benga, it is either a physician, a nurse practitioner, or a psychologist that is authorized to issue that letter.
Okay, that sounds good. And the place of worship. So I know different places have their own ways of participating in a worship. My main concern is if there is a wedding taking place at a church, temple, mosque, whatever you want to call it. Could you elaborate on that, please?
Yes, Councillor. So essentially, the wedding party, who are essentially the center of that event. I don't want to suggest that they're performing, but much like a performance, they're the center of that event. That's what the audience at a wedding is usually looking at. So they would be exempt from wearing masks. And, you know, for example, if a person were coming up to read a psalm or participate in the ceremony by saying something, they could come up wearing their masks, and when they got to the podium, they could take their mask off, do their thing, and then put their mask on before they go back to the audience. Essentially, anybody who is preaching or performing, if you will, at the religious ceremony could be exempt, but the audience who is watching and listening would have to wear masks, including, you know, if and when they're singing.
Okay, and the people who are getting married, at least two of them, and the padre, I guess, are they required to wear a mask?
They would be exempt while they're doing the ceremony. That's what this clearly would allow them to do. So both the individual presiding over the ceremony and the participants, the direct participants in the wedding ceremony would be exempt based on this. And I have to add that the faith community in Edmonton has just been absolutely outstanding at implementing any of our bylaws and any of the health orders. And so I have huge confidence that they will put all the right measures with this kind of guidance, and we can walk them through it if they have any questions.
Okay, and who should they be contacting if they have any questions in regards to this?
Our Padre, Mr. John Dowds.
John
City
Dowds.
Padre, and he will reach out to them, and he has a bit this week and during these conversations.
Okay, and that's all my questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Walters?
Thank you. Thanks for this, Mr. Corbeau. So just in terms of communications out, you know, we talk about communications with BIAs about, you know, rules as they're changing and everything's kind of fluid and helping people understand. Businesses in non-BIA areas, you know, in our sort of more, you know, other commercial and industrial areas that have sort of a public facing, how do we communicate with them, or how do we help them understand what the rules are? Because I'll tell you about a call I had yesterday as an example, but maybe just answer that generally.
Yeah, the main answer is through social media and through our public service announcements. That's how we like to get that information out. And of course, sometimes it takes time in terms of getting it done. But that is the main way of doing it, through BIAs, through specific venues, especially with the specifics of these exemptions. They really apply to specific venues, so we'll get the word out there. As for regular businesses, we can certainly answer questions. We've got an FAQ we'll put up, but primarily it would be through social media and the public service announcements.
Right, so have we done anything then to kind of comfort the public that it's safe, you know, with these rules in place and the restrictions that we have, that it's to encourage people to support these businesses? Has that been part of our communication strategy? Because the example I'll give is the owner of a trampoline park who, you know, when we agreed to reinstate the mask bylaw, you know, within a couple hours, half of his bookings disappeared, right? So, you know, it's not hard to be empathetic to the impact that had on his business. But so if they understand what the rules are and what the exemptions are, meaning people can jump and not wear a mask, and when they walk from the trampoline to their table, they have to put it back on, and when they're sitting down eating their hot dog and pop, then they can take it off again. so that we can help them understand, but can we also help the public understand that, you know, we're explaining these rules to the businesses, you know, it's up to you, but we still encourage you to keep your business, to keep supporting these companies.
Yeah, we've done those kind of consistent communications all along. I think it's been helpful too that we've had medical advice here at council that has reaffirmed time after time that these are reasonable steps for public health. And I'll just ask if Ms. Owen would like to embellish a bit.
Just to add that our strategy all along, as these waves have been shifting, has been to convey to Edmontonians that it's possible to enjoy your city safely if you comply with the regulations as they evolve.
Okay, well, and I would, you know, I'm not going to give any direction about that other than just to suggest that we kind of fine tune that maybe a little bit. Like I hear more and more stories about folks that have, you know, now they have a couple $100,000 of debt that they didn't have before that they're going to have to pay back to their landlords. And they're, you know, and I voted for these mask bylaws all along, and I believe in what Dr. Sikora and others have told us and feel like that's a pretty reasonable approach. But there has been an effect in this call yesterday. I did commit to this gentleman that I would convey this to the council and to the group that, you know, people are really, like when we create a bylaw and then half of his bookings disappear, it's an effect that we're having. And I, you know, defend my decision to provide that safety tactic for our citizens, but also wanted to recognize that it is having an effect. So if there's any way we offset that by our messaging, telling Edmontonians that it is with these rules in place, it's, you know, we're trying to make it safer for you to go out, enjoy the city, and support these businesses so people aren't finding themselves in the situation that this particular gentleman is, which I think many people are, unfortunately. So.
No, I would agree, and we'll do our best to communicate that, certainly going forward, as we have in the past. But I agree that any of these decisions are going to have impacts on folks, and so we have to mitigate those as best possible.
Yeah, this whole thing continues to be really, really rough on so many folks. Okay. That is all I had. Thanks.
Thank you. Councillor Zadig?
Thank you. I think this is pretty reasonable overall, and I'm going to ask a few questions and then speak to it since first reading's on the floor. So just to confirm right off the bat, so right now a wedding conducted inside of a building would require the bride and groom to wear masks.
With our current bylaw, without these amendments, that's correct, Councillor.
Okay, yeah, so that could be an awkward first kiss otherwise. So I support, and with the dancing, I mean, that makes sense, and I'm glad we're not going down the path of getting people to dance back to back, as I think some of us have maybe seen pictures of. But yeah, this is a complex environment, and I'm glad that we're contemplating these exceptions or exemptions. Now, I have two questions that I just wanted to hit on. So at a karaoke event, we have the handling of a microphone. And I know nothing about our mask and temporary face covering bylaw talks about sanitation, but it does occur to me a little bit counterproductive that people would be handing back and forth a microphone where they're speaking into. And of course, a best practice, as many of us in the public eye have probably observed, is sanitizing a microphone or putting some type of cap over top of the head of it. But what's our thoughts around the spread of COVID with the passing of things like that at, say, a karaoke event, just because that's the specific example, but I could probably think of many more examples of like door handles and other things that get touched multiple times.
Yeah. Thanks, Councillor. I think it's a really good question because like we've always said along, while today we're here to talk about a mask bylaw specifically and what the exemptions might be, we always have reinforced that there is lots of other things that can be done, including social distancing, including not going to any of these venues if you're exhibiting symptoms, and you should stay at home. And again, I won't list the 20 other things that everybody should do, but chief among those are things like sanitizing between use of things like microphones. I see that very much as a standard occupational health and safety best practice that the local businesses make as they do their assessments of their workplace, which they have to do by law, and they're all, we're seeing lots of evidence of them all coming to the right conclusions on those types of things. I mean, we here in council chambers wipe down PowerPoint slide flickers as we transfer them from people to people. Doesn't need to be a bylaw, in my opinion. It's part of our occupational health and safety. So I think it's best to just stick in this case to the mask bylaw and the pieces around it, knowing that a lot of businesses are doing just fantastic work with their own occupational health and safety assessments, and then putting protocols in place based on those assessments.
Okay, no, thanks for that. And I wanted to ask about the quality of masks because different vendors produce them in all different shapes and sizes, and this has been an ongoing concern and thought for many people throughout COVID. So obviously we know the N95 is the industry standard for what's the premier mask and what surgeons would likely be using in and out of a pandemic situation, and those that can afford them. But then we have different, 3-ply masks, 2-ply masks. We have cloth masks, homemade masks. So this is not a question around wearing it properly. Obviously, it's supposed to be over your nose and your mouth. And I know that proper wearing is an ongoing concern, but is in this bylaw, which of course has been around for time now, but any contemplation about the materials used? I've almost seen like turtlenecks being pulled over people's faces. Can you just comment on that? And hopefully I'll get still 20 seconds to speak to this at the end, Mr. Corbo.
Yeah, I would say very quickly that we don't envisage mandating what type of mask you have to wear. They all have varying degrees of protection, but what the medical advice we've received is that wearing a mask at all is much better and different than not wearing a mask at all. And so we would not propose getting into the details of what type of materials you use. And part of that reason is, people have lots of different comfort feelings, and so that's why we've really stuck to the concept of face coverings. As long as you're covering your nose and your mouth, you're complying with the bylaw.
All right, well, thanks. And just to speak to this quickly, so of course I'll support this, and with the decisions we make in this chamber, often it's a binary yes or no. And I did have unease with the reintroduction of this bylaw earlier, partly because of the short notice time. Well, I'm running out of time now, so I'll just say that I'm happy to support this and encourage Edmontonians to wear the masks. And it's important that we take time, though, to consult with the public before implementing public policy like this. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Paquette.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and thank you for doing the work to get us here today, to administration. Just a few questions. With ICUs filling up, and Alberta doctors and Edmonton's own doctors kind of begging the province really for a more effective direction and a less effective direction. I'm just wondering how we're going to handle this to assure people that we are going in the right direction. Because I understand, like, reasonable is an interesting word, because a lot of things can be reasonable. But if we're not on the right road, getting to the middle of the road doesn't really get us to the right direction. So I'm just wondering if you could sort of respond to that.
Yeah, Councillor, I mean, I guess I would say it's been helpful when we talk to doctors, and particularly the Edmonton's own medical advisors. As we work through these things, we always talk with AHS and get assurances that what we're doing is safe and is good from a medical perspective. And that's really where we base a lot of our decisions on. So this, once again, was run by those doctors in AHS and deemed reasonable. And I know that that definition is perhaps not precise, but it is sort of helpful to us as we consider these things.
Okay, I guess I'm just experiencing a little cognitive dissonance here. We're hearing things are safe, and yet ICUs are filling up, and children can't get vaccinated. And we know the vaccines are the best protection, but until we reach a certain threshold, it can never be a perfect protection. So, I guess I'm just the worst economic culprit for businesses is the continuation of the pandemic. And the continuation of the pandemic is largely the result of governments continually becoming more lax far earlier than they should. So just thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I would say in this case, council has chosen to increase restrictions based on a large part of that being cases. So this is certainly not an attempt to loosen them up. It's an attempt to understand the practicalities of the new increased restrictions we put in place last week. But we're certainly not contemplating removing those restrictions at this time. If it's council's desire to add more restriction, that would be certainly another discussion that we could provide advice on.
Well, I'm just thinking about the public reaction to Alberta's, the province's approach right now. And the public is very clearly saying that it's not strong enough. And yet we want to, it seems, align ourselves more with the provincial approach, which Edmontonians would say is not strong enough. So it's just a little confusing to me why we would want to do that.
Councillor, because council directed Mr. Corbould to take this action.
Yeah, no, and it's still confusing to me why we're doing that.
I would say, councillor, that our bylaw is more restrictive than the medical health order at this point. And like we said, council has the authority to be more restrictive. And so there's nothing preventing the council from doing more than we have in front of us. I would say the alignment pieces aren't so much about the medical alignment. It's because there's been confusion expressed by Edmontonians on terms and things. That's where we've aligned. And that is all about, I think, increasing the effectiveness of the restrictions by reducing the confusion of different terms between the health order and the city bylaw. So that's really where we've aligned. So, for example, we are not aligning with the province on a complete exemption for all worship areas because we feel strongly that masks should be worn by the audience in those venues.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm going to support this, but I have some very serious concerns about government's backtracking when we're literally in the midst of the fourth wave. So whatever we do, please proceed cautiously. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions? Anyone wishing to speak to it? Councillor Walters, if you could take the chair.
I have the chair, Mr. Mayor.
I appreciate the questions. I think, there was a bit of coverage of our discussion the other day that might have left people with the impression that the city is weakening its face covering bylaw, and I really don't see it that way. I think we're tuning it to the practical realities of feedback that we received from the performing arts community, which has been decimated by this pandemic. And the premise is not that we're choosing less safety. The premise is that it is the responsibility of venue managers and artists to ensure their own safety as a matter of occupational health and safety. And that if they can do that for themselves and for their patrons and keep everyone safe, then they should be permitted the flexibility to do so. I think the overall message here is err on the side of caution. The overall message is not restriction for the sake of restriction. And so this is an opportunity for us to clarify that for the performing arts community, where it is safe to do so and the appropriate alternate mitigations are in place, that we can trust folks, performers and venue managers to make prudent decisions for the protection of their staff and especially their patrons. And if they're not making those decisions, patrons are going to call that out. So some of this is we can trust in people's reasonableness particularly now that people have had a year and a half to think about how to reopen safely with venues and so on and so forth. So my office had a lot of feedback from that community, and I think that these very, very minor tweaks here are in keeping with that. And in the case of houses of worship, I think it's entirely appropriate, and again, echoing what City Manager Corbould has said, our faith community in the city has been, on the whole, extremely thoughtful, from a compassionate and humanitarian and transcendently kind place, doing the right thing here, moving virtually when they needed to, and then reopening as safely as possible in accordance with the rules. And so I think these very minor tweaks here allow certain ceremonies to proceed, ministers to provide, and faith community leaders to provide comfort in this in an unobstructed way. And I think people are yearning for that comfort and that support these days too. And again, provided that distancing or plexi and other mitigations are in place, I think we can trust our faith community leaders who've erred on the side of caution, if anything, through this pandemic here in the city. The same can't be said for some of the outlying areas around us. But I think these are two communities for these two specific exemptions where we can trust in their discretion. And again, people will vote with their feet if the situation looks unsafe. But to Councillor Zadek's point, I think where a household unit is being cohorted in a nuptial sense and about to be consummated, I think that's their business. And so I think these are very reasonable tweaks based on the feedback that city administration and many of our offices received from our publics. But I think the overall message here is to still err on the side of caution as we move through the fourth wave. I think the city's leadership on that is undiminished by these adjustments. And I would just say finally that I think in his not so brief time with us now, Mr. Corbould has demonstrated the kind of trust that has earned him the opportunity to, through the caretaker phase of the election here, if some additional tweaks in this vein are necessary or certain circumstances arise, for him to have the flexibility to do that. And so on all 3 points of these very, very minor adjustments to the bylaw, I'm quite supportive and would just strongly argue against any notion that this is weakening the city's position on the overall set of issues that we are dealing with, given the pressure on the healthcare system, particularly in Edmonton as a healthcare provider for Northern Alberta, where many of our beds have filled up with folks with very low rates of vaccination from the north. And so given that there is that pressure already, I think this is still a very prudent response that still sends the right signal from my perspective. Take the chair back.
Return the chair.
Anybody else wishing to speak? Councillor McKean to close.
Mr. Mayor, I thought you said it nicely. I will add nothing else. Thank you.
Thank you. Please vote on first reading.
Yes.
Yes.
At this point, Mr. Chair, we have all the votes except for Councillor Katarina's. I'm not sure if he's the one who spoke first in saying yes. Councillor Esslinger and Councillor Paquette.
Mr. Clerk, it's a yes for me.
Thank you. We have all the votes.
Anybody else? Or no? Display the vote then. And that's carried unanimously.
Mr. Mayor, I'll move second reading of the bylaw.
Second?
Yes, Mr. Clerk.
Please vote.
Thank you, Councillor Katarina.
Yes, Mr. Clerk.
Yes, Mr. Clerk.
Thank you, Councillor Hamilton. We have all the votes, Mr. Chair.
Display the vote. Glad we can finally agree on something in this respect. That's carried unanimously.
Mr. Mayor, I'll move consideration of third reading on the bylaw.
Second.
Yes, Mr. Clerk.
To allow third reading to proceed, please vote.
Thank you, Councillor Katarina.
Yes, Mr. Clerk.
Yes. Yes, Mr. Clerk.
We are still waiting, Mr. Chair, on Councillor Esslinger and Councillor Walters.
Yes.
Thank you, Councillor Esslinger.
I'm happy to vote yes verbally also.
Thank you.
Display the vote. Carried.
Mr. Mayor?
Mr. Mayor, point of order before third reading. Quick question, basically. The name of this bylaw is potential amendments to the temporary mandatory face coverings bylaw. Should it read potential amendments, given that we're about to give it third reading? And if this doesn't matter, I don't care either.
I don't know. It's an interesting question. Can we, I don't think we can amend it on third reading. But that's, when it becomes law, can we strike that out? Is that a typographic change within the purview of the clerks, or?
I would say we can do that, Mr. Chair. The actual bylaw that was attached says temporary mandatory face covering bylaws, amendment number 4. So I think the difference is only in the title of the report.
The agenda item and the report are called potential amendments. The bylaw itself has a different name in the package.
Yeah,
Is that
the bylaw does not contain the word potential.
satisfactory, Councillor Zadig? Okay. Good question, though. Good question. Any other points? Privilege, information, order?
Mr. Mayor?
Seeing none?
Whatever it's called, I will move third reading.
Second.
Thank you. Please vote.
Yes, Madam. Yes, Mr. Clerk.
Thank you, Councillor
Yes.
Katarina. Hamilton, thank you.
Yes, Mr. Clerk.
Thank you, Councillor Esslinger.
I'll vote
Yes,
in.
Mr. Clerk.
And thanks to both of you. We now have all the votes, Mr. Chair.
Display the vote. That is carried unanimously. Okay, that's all we were here to do for the special city council meeting. So I will, in the interest of time, call it adjourned, and that will give the clerks a bit of time to set up for the 10:30-ish resumption of the public hearing from Wednesday. So it may take them a few more minutes to get fired up than that. So we'll check in at 10:30. So take a 15-minute breather here.